It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
All right. We're back. Thank you for joining with us this morning. We're going to cover some news issues in this last hour. And I want to touch on a couple of issues that are kind of out there in the news today that are fairly appropriate topics for conversation. We keep hearing about the issue of our federal budget, right? Well, I talked about this probably a month ago when the news first broke on here. But what's going on right now is something that's very, very serious indeed. And we're not hearing about it from the mainstream media and the Ministry of Propaganda. And I want you to be cognizant of it because we should each be asking, especially in these town hall opportunities we have over the course of the next couple of weeks, our representatives to explain themselves and explain this. What I'm talking about here is the Treasury, because they ran a $98 billion deficit in July alone. And yet, the national debt has stayed exactly at $16,699,396 for months now. Now, that's impossible. In other words, the deficit is supposed to be a daily reflection on our financial stability here and where we stand. But the Treasury Department's financial management services, and they publish these numbers, by the way, daily, they have been reporting that in July the federal government ran a deficit of $98 billion. And yet the debt has not changed. So we have to ask ourselves the question why. I mean, what's the motivation for that? And everything these days seems to be politically motivated in some way, shape, or form. So here's what you need to know. The amount that they're currently showing is the public debt, $16.7 trillion. Let's just use that number. I don't want to go through that whole long diatribe at 12 zeros again, but it's $16.7 trillion, okay? It's $25 million, $25 million below the legal limit. Now, for the record, $25 million is in government. They're spending more than that spending 10 times that per second. Okay? And so you can do the math yourself. What is $98 billion divided by $20 billion? And that shows you how often they're, how fast they spend that. So what this tells us is that they're hovering the number just $25 million below the legal limit of what they can spend. And we keep hearing all this talk about government shutdown and the Republicans are going to destroy themselves and dash themselves on the rocks of public opinion. That's from other Republicans, by the way. And then we're hearing from the Democrats, a government shutdown will be all those dopey Republicans trying to destroy our government. Nobody's going to get paid and the Army's going to go starving. Well, the truth is, we're already well over what we're legally allowed to spend. The government should already be shut down, and nobody is acknowledging it. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party are in league with this. because I'm not hearing about any congressional hearings on it. I'm not hearing the Ministry of Propaganda spewing this all over the news like a clown at a rodeo who made fun of the president. You see, Boehner, the head of the House, the Speaker, he is the guy who ultimately, because he leads the House and the House owns the purse strings, he should be spouting this from the top of the rooftops like Paul Revere. But he's not. See, the new Treasury Secretary, which is Jack Lew, now he's a long-time administration, player. He's been in this administration since day one in various roles. So he's definitely an Obama guy. He's now the Treasury Secretary. And he sent a letter to Speaker Boehner saying that he was beginning to implement what he called, and this is his quote now, the standard set of extraordinary measures to prevent the Treasury from exceeding the legal limit on the federal budget. Now, with all this talk of sequester and how dire it was going to be and how dangerous it was going to be and how it was going to, completely upset the entire apple cart of government and everything was going to get shut down, everybody was going to furlough, and man, the dogs and cats weren't going to eat, and my goodness, pools were going to go dry, the whole 9 yards, right? Why aren't they talking about this? Makes you wonder, huh? So, what are the extraordinary measures? Let's get below the level of that and know, what do you classify or consider an extraordinary measure? Are you cutting spending? Or are you just hiding what you're doing? Because if you're cutting spending, I applaud and laud that. But if what you're doing is some kind of parlor trick with your accounting books, then I and everyone else has a problem with that. From both sides of the political spectrum. You already, as a government, utilize accounting principles that you would throw companies in prison for using. I mean, there's a system out there called GAAP. G-A-P-P. And it stands for Generally Accepted Accounting, GAT, excuse me. Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. And it's G-A-A-P. Now, GAAP is, if you talk to a CPA or any accountant and you say, what's GAAP? They'll say, well, these are the rules by which accounting must adhere to in order to fall into line in a legal context. Anything outside of that would be considered malfeasance. Yet government does not use GAAP accounting. If a company steps outside the boundaries of GAAP, and they, private or public, by the way, and they try to play and keep double sets of books or, manipulate the income versus the expenditures and other kinds of things like that, or try to take money out of this account and put it in that account and double count it as an asset twice, they would go to prison for that. And yet, our government does it every single day. They consider, as an example, the amount of money in the Social Security fund as an asset. But it's not there. It's an IOU. And at the same point in time, they've taken that money out and spent it, and then floated Treasury bills to cover it, and they count that as the same asset, but twice. Now, I recall this company called Enron, where people went to prison for that. It's just not accepted legal practice. It's not ethical, it's not moral, and it's not honest. The reason GAAP is so critically reviewed in corporations is because investors have a right to know what the true financial state of that company is. They've got their money and their investments tied up in it. And so, in theory, if they're being lied to, they can't make intelligent decisions about, is this the right investment for me, or is this maybe a time for me to get out because the company's going upside down? Now, I grant you, we can't pull our investment out of government. But let's not make the mistake of thinking we're actually not invested. We are. Every time you pay a tax bill, every time you go to the grocery store and you pay taxes, every time you buy an automobile and they hit you with that tax bill for sales tax, every time your paycheck comes in and you see that chunk they took out, that's your investment. You're paying into the system. Now, your investment may, be graduated and over a long period of time, but let's not pretend that we're not investing. It may not even be willful. Most people don't want to pay taxes at all. And they do so under coercion and compulsion. But it is an investment nonetheless. And I think we have a right to know where we really stand fiscally at any given moment. Now, because government makes the rules, they set rules up for themselves that nobody else could follow. Because to follow those rules, anybody else would be in federal prison. And that's the simple truth. This isn't something that is unique or, that is allowable anywhere else but in government. The type of accounting they use, double counting, projecting these enormous incomes that are based on projections that aren't even predicated upon fact. I mean, come on, folks. If you owned a company that did $10 million a year in year one and in gross sales, and then $11 million in year two and $12 million in year three and 13 and on and on and on and on and on, and you've got a long history of growing that company, growing the gross income, and then suddenly you go to a bank and you're borrowing money and you project your sales to be growing at a rate of $25 million a year in an effort to try to obtain that loan, the bank would laugh at you first and foremost. They would look at that and say, well, you got a history of growth of $1 million a year, and suddenly now, all overnight, you're telling me you're going to grow by $25 million a year. Sorry, the history doesn't support it. So how is it government does that and gets away with it? Those are the questions that we should be asking our leadership. Those are the questions that Mr. Liu should be answering, not sending an explanation of what extraordinary measures he's taking for the past 87 days. Folks, 3 months they've been hiding the truth from us, and no one has mentioned it. No one is mentioning that we are out of money. The government's only funded until October. And now they're talking about, we're going to shut government down because if they don't repeal Obamacare, we're just not going to pass a budget and blah, 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 and all that diatribe and diarrhea. It's already happened. That's my point. We're already spending money that doesn't exist. We're out of money, and we have been for 90 days. If you were a wealthy Hollywood star or starlet, and you had an accountant that managed your money for you, right? I mean, let's be honest. Most people who are very wealthy, they don't really sit there and balance their own checkbook. I mean, that's the simple reality of it. They have an accountant who handles their money, or an investment advisor or whatever. And, they spend what they spend. They go back to their accountant every once in a while, and the accountant says, things are a little tighter now. You haven't made a movie in a little while. I know you got that one for $20 million on the hook, but, until you bring it in, you got to cut back on expenses a little. If that person didn't say anything to the Hollywood star, and that Hollywood star continued to spend money like water. Oh, $95,000 for a hotel room for the weekend. No problem. Taking my favorite girl to the beach. Champagne, wine, caviar, and lobster tails for everybody. And they only had $50,000 in their account. Wouldn't that accountant be guilty of malfeasance for not notifying them In other words, here's a person who's now criminally spending money they don't have, because it is criminal, right? I mean, bouncing a check is a crime, but only if you do it willfully. If you don't know, then it's back to the responsibility for that falls on the person who's managing your books for you. In this case, it's the Treasury. And the watchdog and the overseer of that is John Boehner. The starlet is still spending like a drunken sailor. But the accountants haven't notified him, you better stop. You're overextended, and you're in default. So I ask you, where do we go from here? How do we obtain and demand a true accounting of government? The truth is, everybody talks about fraud, waste, and abuse. But if you want to get to the bottom of fraud, waste, and abuse, let's start doing it by doing some accounting and bookkeeping that everyone can follow because everyone has practice at it. You can't get Deloitte and Touche to walk in there and monitor the federal government's books because they don't use the standard accounting principles that everybody else on the planet is required to use. And so it's always subjective. Well, the Department of this says we can spend that. Prove it. Show us the books. They can't. Because if we ever truly, as Americans, understood the true depth of our financial situation, we would realize that we are the Hollywood starlet spending $95,000 for a hotel room when we're already $7.5 million in debt, and we haven't signed the contract for the new $20 million movie yet. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the definition of malfeasance on the part of our accountant, on the part of our broker, on the part of us for not knowing. We have an obligation to know. We have a duty to know. And we have a right to know. If we're ultimately going to be held responsible, if that star is the one who's going to go to jail for running into the red and spending rubber checks, then that star has a right to know. We are the investors here. This company is in big financial trouble, and we have a right to know just how deep it is. Because we're investors who, for all intents and purposes, we can't even pull our money out. We can't sell and let someone else absorb the risk. The risk is all ours. But we have none of the rights that go along with that risk. And that's a problem. See, we're supposed to be able to trust with our fiduciary liabilities those people who are advising us, our legislative and administrative leaders, including Jack Lew and John Boehner. Now, Lew's not elected, he's appointed. But Boehner's elected. And frankly, I mean, if you want to look at it that way, truly, Lew is appointed because really he's appointed by Obama and Obama is elected. So, when you bring in a president, you expect that he's going to bring in people he trusts to do the right job. See, that's where the problem lies with all of this. Here we are trusting a bunch of people that, quite frankly, are not trustworthy, and they use a shell game to explain our financial position to us, the investors, the owners of this company. And we're on the hook. We're the ones who are responsible to cover the losses. And right now, the losses are staggering. I mean, we're talking $17 trillion in real debt, which is really not even what the true number is. We only know we're $17 trillion in debt. What are we really, truly in debt? We'll never know, because even after they refund the government in September, October, November, December, February, March, whatever it turns out to be when they finally settle it, after how many continuing resolutions, because they can't bring themselves to actually do something right. At the end of the day, guess what? They're still never going to go out here and give you the proof and evidence that they've been manipulating the books, because that proves the malfeasance and subjects them to criminal prosecution. I mean, you know, this is logic. And when you're talking about math, emotion never comes into it. Numbers are numbers. They're objective. They're not subjective. 2 plus 2 always equals 4. Never 4.3, 4.7, 3.9. It's always 4. Always. You cannot be subjective with math. And books are math. They're nothing else. No amount of emotion can give you positive cash flow. No amount of emotion can wipe out the red. No amount of emotion can give you money to spend on the causes and the beliefs that you have if it's not really there. And you know, you need to understand something. The quantitative easing that the Fed has been doing for the past couple of years now is essentially buying all of our own debt back. I mean, the Fed started out in 2007 with $385 billion on their books. They're now at $3.5 trillion, and that's all we know about. So what I'm trying to tell you is this. We're not borrowing money from China because they're not lending it. The amount of money that we owe China and Japan, the two biggest debt holders we have, is static. It hasn't changed. They're not borrowing more. We are pretending to sell the debt, but we're selling the debt to the Fed, and therefore we're selling it to ourselves. What that means is that the Fed has to consistently print more money, which lowers the value of all the money in circulation. And ultimately, that causes inflation and the lowering of the value of the dollar. Look, milk hasn't really gone up in price. Neither has gasoline. What's gone down is the value of the dollar. When you walk in and you find that ground beef, which used to be $1.79 a pound, is now up to $2.89 or $3.29, it's not that ground beef has gone up in price. It's that the money in your pocket is worth less. And it's worth less because the more we owe and the more we keep playing these shell games with our money, the worse our situation gets. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll hit on some other topics. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host here. Please find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org. You can also find us at Facebook, and I encourage you to do so. Find us at facebook.com/America's Voice Now. Then find this and every other show that we do live on YouTube at youtube.com/America's Voice Now. Thanks for being with us. We'll be right back.